Hi, everyone. I'm Molly O'Rourke. I am an executive in residence at the School of Communication at American University. I'm also one of the directors of the master's program in political communication. Tonight, I am filling in for my colleague and my friend, Betsy Fisher Martin. I want to welcome everyone to our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. We're so glad to have everyone here. And to those of you who are new to our events, just give a brief introduction. The Women in Politics Institute is a nonprofit and a nonpartisan institute in AU's School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. So we offer academic and practical campaign training programs. We facilitate research and discussions like this one about women in politics and in leadership. And tonight we're especially excited to have one of the top political operatives in the country, Lis Smith, who at the age of 39 has already been in the trenches and worked for dozens of top political campaigns, from Senator Claire McCaskill to Governor Terry McAuliffe, Governor Martin O'Malley, and most notably Mayor Pete Buttigieg on his 2020 presidential campaign. She also has a best-selling book out called Any Given Tuesday, A Political Love Story. And in it, she writes candidly about her life on the campaign trail and being a young woman in politics and the lessons that she's learned along the way. So before we start, I just want to remind everyone that like our usual format, we will save time for questions at the end of the hour. So as you're listening, please feel free to use the question tab on Zoom to post a question that I'll be reviewing, and we'll circle around after we've had a conversation and I'll come to your questions. So let's get right to it. Lis, welcome, and thank you for being here all the way, I think, from Los Angeles.
Yes, from my lovely hotel room in Los Angeles. Thanks for having me. This is so cool. I wish in college that we'd had something like this at Dartmouth. Yeah, it's great.
I always say the same. I wish that we had all of these kinds of resources and opportunities when I was in college. I want to start off by asking you about your book. I can imagine that writing a memoir, even during a pandemic when you have a lot of time on your hands, is a daunting task. And you certainly have lots of great stories here. And those in the audience who are political junkies will love hearing some of your insider accounts of some of the stories that we've only read about in the newspaper or online. But give us a little bit of a sense of why you wrote the book and who your audience is, what you hope readers, what kinds of readers you wanted to engage, and what you hope they'll take away from the book.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a good question. Why did I write the book? I'm a pretty ambitious person, but I really never ever thought that I would write a book. It takes a lot of time, a lot of focus. And, I'm the type of person where if I'm going to do a book, I'm going to write it myself, not have a ghostwriter or anything like that. But it so happened I got approached about writing a book right after Pete dropped out of the presidential race, which was it was the first week of March 2020, which happened to coincide with the beginning of the global pandemic and the lockdown. So I figured, well, if there's any time that I'm actually going to be able to sit down, focus, and write a book, I'm going to make the most out of this. And this is the time. And it just seemed like a sign for me to do it. I realized that I did have a lot of stories to share. Yes, some of the fun, gossipy stories, but stories about lessons I'd learned in politics, stories about lessons I'd learned in life. And it's a very, very interesting lifestyle that a lot of people don't understand, and sort of the time commitments that go into it. And everyone is really, really, these days, I think, really, really hungry for information about politics and how it works. And I just saw that there was really a gap in sort of a gap in the market for a book that sort of explained what it's actually like behind the scenes of politics, the good, the bad, the ugly. And so I wanted to sort of illuminate it for people. And my audience for this, and I was really dead set on this going into it, which was not to get into the weeds of how a book gets made, but when I picked out an agent, when I went with an agent, I decided to go with a non-political agent because I wanted the audience for this to not just be political junkies, not just Democrats, not just Republicans, but I wanted it to be really, really accessible to people outside of the political realm, to maybe, I don't know, maybe get them interested, and maybe get them involved too, but to sort of shed some light on how this bizarre business works. So, and I've gotten really good feedback about that from Democrats, from like top Republicans, and also from people who aren't political at all.
So let's start off with that. Thinking back on the many clients who you've had, is there a campaign experience or a candidate that you can identify as really having learned a lot from? And what did you learn? Was it something about policy? Was it something about you personally? Was it something about the way the world works? What was like a really important learning opportunity for you working on the campaign trail?
Look, there's no campaign experience, even though it was very, very late in my career, was definitely Pete's campaign, because, and I think what it taught me is the importance of like innovating in campaigns, even, and I use this in the small C way, but campaigns and politics, it's a very conservative industry where people just tend to do the same things over and over again. And people are pretty risk averse about trying out new tactics. But Pete knew that if he was going to go anywhere in the presidential race as a 37-year-old openly gay mayor of a town of 100,000 people, right? Not exactly who you would think of as the type of person that would vault to the front in Iowa.
Right.
He was going to need to take some risks, and he was going to need to do things differently. And he didn't have access to big donors like other candidates did. He had zero name ID and like a tough Maltese last name to boot. And so that the one thing that I pitched him on was like, let's just go all out in the media and do something, have a earned media strategy. And earned media means, it's just like a fancy term for press strategy versus paid media ads. You probably explained this in your other Women on Wednesdays, but and so that's what we did. And then, and so, you know, and on top of doing all the traditional political press, I had him doing, and I just saw him, like, I'm seeing him later tonight, but I just saw him on TMZ Live, right? I was putting him on sports outlets, I was putting on entertainment outlets, putting him in fashion magazines. And if there are three things that Pete Buttigieg doesn't know anything about, I would say fashion, sports, and celebrity gossip. But it was a strategy that really paid off, because we made it so that it was pretty much impossible to somehow not hear of Pete. And that even if you weren't a political person, you were going to get a dose of him in your life. And because he was someone, it's not a strategy that works for everyone, but because he is someone who is just so good at doing interviews, it was a strategy that really, really played to his strengths and allowed him to take off. So it taught me the importance of innovating. It taught me the importance of being willing and able to take risks, because like a lot of gray hairs in the political world thought I was insane for doing this, and thought Pete was insane for letting me sort of craft this strategy. They're like, don't you think he's doing too much media? Don't you think you're exposing him? And it's like, well, this is the only path that we have. So that was an important thing. But I think also what it taught me on a personal level and about myself was that the importance of when someone gives you a lot of power and puts a lot of trust and faith in you, that one, it teaches you to believe more in yourself, but it gives you the confidence to really run with something. Because like, you know, I think if people didn't know me outside of the political context, they might be like, what sort of lunatic is going to hand over the keys to a presidential campaign to Lis Smith? But he did, and it paid off. And it was, it really gave me a lot of confidence in myself and my abilities, and that you sometimes don't get, you know, I always am second guessing myself. So those are the things I learned both about politics and myself.
That's great. I wanted to ask, you know, when you say giving confidence in yourself, one of the things that the Women in Politics Institute does in particular is to focus on training women to run for office and helping them to prepare, to know what it's going to be like. And we know that some of the guidance and even some of the skills that women need to prepare to run for office are different than what a lot of men need in terms of getting ready, and feeling confident about running for office. From your perspective as an advisor, what's the difference between you've worked for top male candidates and female candidates? Is there a difference or a generalization that you picked up on?
Let's see. And like right now, I'm advising a female candidate, a female politician, a woman politician in Michigan, Mallory McMorrow, who some of you guys might know. She had a big viral moment and is total star in the Democratic Party. Yeah, well, I think that there are certain things with women that are tougher, right? They're like, and I hate to make generalizations, but generalizations are generalizations usually because they're somewhat true or rooted in the truth. But women are, and I consider myself one of these people, like less good at asking for money, less good at fundraising, less good at asking other people for anything. And so I have noticed that sometimes with women candidates that they're less likely just to pick up the phone and be willing to call someone and say, give me $1 million or $100,000 or $2,500, whatever it is. But in terms of the expectations of women candidates and the sort of constraints put on them, yeah, like it is harder I think men are allowed to be sort of these outlandish, can be these outlandish characters, right? And it's harder for women to do that. It's harder for women to be brash and to be as forward as male candidates can be. Claire McCaskill did have a little bit of that sort of swagger, but and now we are starting to see more female politicians with the traditional male politician swagger. But I think that for a while, that for a very long time, that whenever women did sort of try to exude that sort of same swagger, that they were called either, labeled as bitchy, sorry for the cuss word, or overly assertive or unlikable. But now you definitely do see women politicians who are going out and being more unabashedly confident in themselves and their abilities and willing to like sort of do the same sort of, I don't know, brash things that male politicians do. I'm trying to think of a PG way to say it. So there's that, but then there's no question that women politicians have to deal with a lot of extra like BS that male politicians don't have to, like scrutiny of their looks, scrutiny of their outfits, scrutiny of their voices and the way that they talk. It's like, do they have a baby voice, or is their voice too deep, or do they talk too fast, or do they say like too much? And that you really just don't see with this similar scrutiny of male politicians. And so that adds another layer of it, because like when a woman politician is going on camera, and like this is one thing, and I've talked with some women politicians about this, and it's sort of fascinating because you might think it's very superficial, but it's not. We live in a superficial society, but the amount of time that it takes for a woman to get ready for a TV hit, to be camera ready, right? To get her hair done, to get her makeup done, on top of all the prep, it's like, it adds on an hour and a half of time that they have to do on top of everything else, where with a man, they can just get powder on their face and they're good to go. And that's stuff that eats into your day, eats into your prep time for other things, eats into your call time for fundraising. And if let's say you say, okay, well, you know what, I'm not going to waste my time on hair and makeup, then people will say, well, she looks tired, or she looks, awful on TV, or why can't she even put herself together, and it's just women politicians have to deal with that sort of BS, and it's really, really frustrating sometimes, and there's no great answer, and some of this stuff we haven't figured out yet.
And is your sense that that's getting better? Are things improving in that regard?
So in the first regard, yes, because I do think that like now you do see female politicians, women politicians who are going out there and, are willing to like mix it up a little more, like male politicians are willing to be a little more brassy and out there, whether
Are
it's
they
like
still paying a price for that?
Maybe, but less of one, I think, less of one. But in terms of the superficial aspects, it hasn't gotten better, and I don't think that gets better until society gets better about those things.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about the mythical role of a strategist or an operative on a campaign. So, there's shows like The West Wing and Veep, and you say in your book that actually the documentary, The War Room, was very important experience for you. Are those portrayals accurate? And tell us a little bit about kind of the life on the campaign trail and the success of a campaign. Does it depend primarily on the quality of the candidate or the political environment that you're in? And how much do the skills of the campaign staff or the quality of the campaign staff really matter in terms of making important strategic decisions?
So in terms of the depiction of politics on camera, I've never seen a good fictional rendering of politics. So the West Wing is like way too idealistic. People in politics aren't like that, and they don't speak in these, Aaron Sorkin-esque paragraphs, right? And not everything has this beautiful, inspiring soundtrack to it. I'm sorry, like, I wish I could tell you it's like that, but it's not. It's not like Veep, because Veep is sort of placed in a comedic element. And yes, you definitely have elements of Veep in politics, and you definitely have elements of West Wing in politics, but you definitely do have some bumbling, inept moments. Even the smartest people have their Selena moments. And it's not really like House of Cards either, which makes everyone seem like they're a scheming, conniving, whatever. It's just really more like everyone in politics is just like a normal person to some, well, a very abnormal normal person with the same flaws and strengths that people in other industries have. And I'm, fingers crossed, I'm hoping to turn my book into a fictional, to transition it into a fictional rendering for TV, and maybe we can finally break the curse. But so yeah, I don't think, but if you do want to see an accurate rendering of what it's like behind the scenes, I really, really recommend for everyone to watch The War Room. It was done like 30 years ago. Oh my God. It was about the 1992 Clinton campaign. But one thing you'll notice when you see it is that there are no female strategists in it. It's just like you see George Stephanopoulos, you see James Carville primarily. And the only woman who gets extended screen time on it is Jennifer Flowers, which is so depressing. So if you are looking to see a rendering of women strategists on TV or in a movie, it's not going to be in The War Room. But in terms
we have to
of
wait
like
for your series to come out. To
exactly, and it's gonna have a a foul-mouthed female lead. But in terms of with campaigns and sort of how they work with strategists, the team, candidates, yeah, the candidate quality matters a lot. Like if you have a really, really bad candidate, it doesn't matter sometimes how good the electoral environment is, you can still lose. That being said, some really bad candidates do sometimes sneak through based on that. And it really depends on the level of office that you're running for. So like in a wave year, 2022 was supposed to be a wave year, right? Because of the Dobbs decision, everything has gotten scrambled. But in a year like 2022, that's where what it was looked like in March. That's where you would have seen some real turkeys, some real zeros get across the finish line, that maybe now because of the environment won't, in terms of on the Republican side. But like, in a wave year, especially if you're running for Congress, just like a House seat, people don't pay that much attention. So yeah, that's where it gets a little tougher. But I think the best campaigns are where you have a really good candidate, you have a really good team that complements the candidate. And the best campaign teams, I think, are teams that bring sort of like, what's that book called about the Lincoln cabinet, the team of rivals, right? Where you have, and with Pete's campaign, what was interesting is, if you look at Pete's top advisors, we were all very different in our backgrounds, very different in our styles, very different in sort of our areas of expertise. And we all brought different opinions to the table. And so that he always knew he was getting the best advice. And ultimately, he would be the decision maker on things. But it kept the campaign fresh. It kept him on his toes. And it ensured that we always were bringing sort of new strategies to things, and not just doing things the way that they'd always been done. Even though we had some advisors who were, in their 60s and things like that. And it is very helpful, by the way, to have like diversity in terms of race, gender, age, regional, where you're from in the country. We had a pollster who was from Australia, because all those different perspectives mean that people are bringing different things to the table. And the political industry is traditionally dominated by older white men, and that's why you sort of see ads that always look the same year after year after year. So I think that is really important. But as I mentioned, the environment is even the best candidate can lose in a really bad environment. So it's a mixture of the three that really determines a candidate's fate.
So you mentioned in that answer a little bit about what's happening currently in 2022 midterms. The conventional wisdom is right now that the trajectory has turned a little bit for Democrats, that Biden's numbers are up, and that some of the kind of key high profile Republican candidates in some notable races have stumbled or don't seem like they're quite measuring up. And there's the Dobbs decision, as you mentioned. Do you see that? As you think about the next 7 or 8 weeks, do you think that momentum will continue? Do you think the so-called red wave will just turn into a little bit of a ripple? What do you see?
Yeah, so man, it makes me so nervous. I was talking about this earlier today, because we saw how quickly, and it is really, 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 really rare that you have something as earth-shattering as Dobbs. And midterm elections are generally very, very predictable. The only other thing that in my lifetime that was like this was another earth-shattering thing. It was 9/11, and that was the only reason why Bush was able to completely beat back the trend of the party in power losing losing seats in the first midterm election. So Dobbs has really scrambled the equation, and the fact that it scrambled it so quickly and so definitively makes me a little bit nervous that it could be scrambled back. Mm-hmm. However, I don't think it's going to be, because this issue isn't going away. And this is an issue that is, we in politics, we use a lot of hyperbole. We talk about issues being a matter of life and death. This literally is an issue of life and death. And it's something that women feel very personally and viscerally, but really we've seen in terms of polling and attitudes among men, that they pull the same on this issue as women do. I just think that the intensity is obviously a little bit stronger for women. And we've seen that in focus groups, we've seen that in voter registration numbers. And where I think that Dobbs really is going to impact the election is, in two ways. One, it woke up Democrats. Democrats are like, what do you call the Christians who only go to church on Easter? The Easter Christmas Christians or whatever. Right. Democrats are like that with where they vote in general elections, not so good at voting in midterm elections. The Republicans just have always had a better sort of turnout for traditionally better midterm turnout game. But this has woken up Democrats, because it's really hard to sit on your hands when all this stuff is at stake. But we've also seen that it has turned a lot of swing voters, the people who you think of as, the Republicans who voted for, or Republicans or independents who voted for Biden, who might have otherwise gone back toward, a Republican candidate this cycle, like we saw in Virginia, for instance, the Biden Youngkin voters. It's just a bridge too far for them. And as a result, that they are now turning back to Democrats, whether it's for in House races, gubernatorial races, or state leg races, or Senate races. So I think it's going to continue to be a big motivating factor. The big question is what happens with House races, because I think we'll keep the Senate. I think Democrats will hold the Senate, but with House races, we're now seeing Democrats pulling even in the generic ballot, or even, I think yesterday, Real Clear Politics had the average at 1% above, which seems a little rosy to me, but I asked some pollsters and they said they really are seeing it. So, today I would tell you, if I had to bet all of my money on it, I would say we win the Senate, we lose the House narrowly, but it's possible. Crazier things have happened than us winning the House this year.
So as long as we've got you in the forecasting business now, and we've got you nailed down to Democrats holding the Senate, that's your prediction, and
Yeah.
narrow loss in the House. Let's move the timeline 2 years further. And I know that 2024 presidential election has in some ways already started, but it will certainly start full scale on November 9th. Can you handicap the field a little bit? And can you also tell us, are you planning to play a role in the 2024 presidential election?
Oh my God. I hope not. I need to get like a real balanced life at some point. And one thing I tried to capture in my book, Any Given Tuesday, is just the all-consuming nature of this line of work. And for anyone who's thinking about going into politics, thinking about going into campaigns, it's just sort of a reality, which is that like, if you're looking for work-life balance, this is probably not the best profession, right? You're not going to have dedicated gym time every day or time to yourself, or even, and it does take a toll on your interpersonal relationships. But back to your initial question, which was about 2024. Okay, so I know that everyone in DC loves to talk about, is Joe Biden going to run or not?
Right.
Like, he has had a really strong run for the last 3 months. We got the CHIPS bill passed. He got he got infrastructure last year. He got the Inflation Reduction Act. He killed the head of Al Qaeda. So, like, if you are Joe Biden, why the heck wouldn't you run? And I feel like it's just DC, like DC journalists love to gossip about this stuff. It's more interesting if there's a thought that there'll be some open field like 2020 with all sorts of different personalities. But my prediction is Joe Biden runs for re-election, and I think he should, because I think he's done a pretty darn good job and gotten a lot of things done as president. On the Republican side, now that is a whole different story. Everyone, and I'd be interested in hearing like other people's thoughts maybe in the chat, who they think would be is Republicans' best bet in 2024. But right now, so much of the attention is on I think Donald Trump, short of the Justice Department indicting him, is going to run. And I have some friends in Trump world on the Death Star or whatever you want to call it. And they told me as of 6 months ago, he was 100% in. But I don't know, the stuff with the documents at Mar-a-Lago, again, it shows you how everything can change on a dime, and no one was expecting that. Like, I wouldn't have expected that plot twist. If Trump runs, I do not see anyone being able to run a credible campaign against him, because he has such a vice-like grip on the Republican electorate, and it just seems like it's impossible to get his voters to move away from him. If he doesn't run, I think you're going to see a pretty big field. The person who gets the lion's share of attention right now is Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida.
And you said you wanted the people to ask in the chat room, and we have gotten a couple of chats.
Oh, good. Okay.
What do you think of Ron DeSantis?
So I think he is extremely overrated, and I think that people are putting a little bit too, are just like focusing on him a little bit too much, just because it's easier, like versus actually having to go out and focus, like learn more about all these other governors or senators that aren't necessarily household names. But he sort of reminds me, one, I think he's peaking a little too soon, but two, he's got a successful playbook. It's not my playbook. I want to be clear. It's not a playbook that I endorse or approve of, but he's taking from the Trump playbook and the Chris Christie playbook that came before the Trump playbook. And something else I write about in my book, not that I'm trying to plug it or anything, but which is that he realizes that the one thing that really motivates Republican voters is there is hate. And how much you hate the people that they hate. With Chris Christie, he rode that formula to a lot of success, and people in 2012 were hoping for him to jump in the race late. He hated public employees and teachers, and he would make a spectacle out of always attacking teachers at his town halls. Donald Trump, it was immigrants. With Ron DeSantis, it is the health experts. And he is all in on the strategy of saying, these people tried to ruin our state. I fought them. We kept Florida free, etc. But I just don't think he'll wear well. He is not known for being a particularly nice person. He's not known for being particularly gregarious. People who work with him don't like him. He's not good at the glad handing aspects of politics, of calling up donors, of shaking hands, all of that stuff. And that's really, really hard if you're not like, if you don't have that sort of cult-like rock star quality. And I'm not saying this in a positive way like Trump does. I just don't know how that's going to wear well. So that's my thought on DeSantis. Who else did?
They're also really interested in what you make of Liz Cheney and her future.
Oh God, look, I would love to say that she's got some big bright future ahead of her. And it is something that's so bizarre because like if you had asked me 4 years ago to name some of my least favorite Republicans, I think she would easily have been in my top 10. And now there's no doubt that she had shown immense courage, right? And she was willing to she didn't have to do any of this. She didn't have to give up her career. And a lot of people have thrown themselves, have thrown their lot in with Donald Trump. But she didn't. And I think she deserves a lot of credit for that. But I just don't see her having a future in the Republican Party, given its fealty to Donald Trump. But, she probably can raise some money, maybe play in some races for some Democrats. But the Republican Party does not seem to have much of an appetite for, someone with her politics these days.
Great. So we've gotten some great predictions or forecasts out of you. Democrats are going to keep the Senate, lose the House narrowly by less than expected. You think Biden's running? You think Trump is running? You think DeSantis is overrated? You think Liz Cheney has a little bit of an uphill struggle or not a little bit, an uphill struggle to make it on the Republican side?
Yeah, and I think Democrats will can have some luck on the state level because in state legislative races, like I think, for instance, in Michigan, I think we'll be able to maybe flip the state Senate there. And why does that matter if you're not from Michigan? You might ask that. Well, now with the Dobbs decision, essentially throwing abortion back to the states, like state legislative races matter so much. Gubernatorial races matter so much. And it's not just Dobbs, next it could be LGBTQ rights and protections. It could be voting, additional voting rights stuff. So the state level races are really important. And we've seen a lot more interest among Democrats in those races. So I think that we will make some gains on the state level in both gubernatorial and state legislative control.
So I will go to questions from our audience, but I wanted to just ask you a few more questions about things that you
Okay, I'll be quick.
About
okay.
in the book. You talk about having a really special relationship with your dad and how he influenced you and including your professional career. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, you look, again, it's just the value of having one. I mentioned before that politics is a very taxing business. And it's really hard because you're going to miss a lot of, if you're on a top tier campaign, you're going to miss a lot of friends' weddings, right? You're going to miss a lot of baby showers. And so it does make the relationships that you have and the close relationships that you have that much more valuable. And for me, I had a very close relationship with my dad, and he was someone who was really encouraging, gave me a lot of great advice. And it illustrated to me the importance of having supportive people like that in your life, who understand the taxing nature of it, but are always willing to offer you advice, always willing to call you, if it's a late night and you're driving across the country and you need to stay up, to be on the phone with you and offer you words of encouragement, to read your clips, to read about your candidates. So that was really, really helpful for me to have. And it just goes sort of back to what I was saying about Pete, is like just the importance of having a support structure and having people believe in you. And that really was the value of my relationship with my dad.
Mm-hmm. You also talk in your book kind of pretty candidly, and I know our audience is especially interested in what life is like on the campaign trail for women in particular, and the dynamics and some of the double standards that you talked about earlier in terms of how women candidates are judged. Tell us a little bit in terms of the behind the scenes aspect of it. You write about a particular encounter you had with Mika Brzezinski when you were staffing Mayor
Right.
Pete early on an appearance on Morning Joe. Can you say a little bit about that and just about what it's like, what the double standard is behind the scenes for top level campaign strategists like yourself?
Yeah, well, it's a similar thing. It's very, the same sort of constraints that exist for female candidates, the same sort of BS they have to deal with, female strategists have to deal with. It's, obviously on a different level. But I'm trying to, because politics traditionally, as I mentioned before, it has always sort of been dominated by older white men. And so you've seen fewer women either running for office, but also in positions of leadership on campaigns. So there's no like perfect template for how a female campaign strategist should act. I certainly don't necessarily fit the mold of your traditional senior advisor for a presidential candidate. And you do get, whereas my male colleagues could sort of roll into meetings or, go around with the candidates sort of dressed in sweats and roll, just sort of like they just rolled out of bed. As a woman, you're expected to, it's more superficial. You got to look nice, but you can't dress too sexy because then people might get the wrong idea. You're judged for how you present yourself in meetings, all that stuff. I tend to reject those things. The one thing I talk about in my book is Mika Brzezinski gave me advice, which is that as a woman, I don't like present as too sexy. Don't wear clothing that will then make people focus on that aspect of you. Just be comfortable and just fade more into the background. And it might seem like it's sexist advice, right? But that's not why I put it in there. And I didn't put it in there. And what's fascinating to me is when men have read the book, they think that what I wrote was like maybe negative about Mika. When women read the book, women who've been in the professional sphere, they are like, oh, what? Oh, I totally get it. I totally get it, because we are held to different standards. And it was really good advice that how you dress, how you look does play into people's perception of you. And that's something you always have to be conscious of, whether it's fair or not, because but life isn't fair. So, and that's just something that you sort of learn to deal with. But I wouldn't say that I conform to all the rules of politics and that I try to be like everyone else and try to play it safe. So it's not like you have to be a man, act like the men or act like the boys or dress like the boys to be as successful as they do. You just have to navigate things a little differently.
So Mika gave you some advice. I guess I'd like to ask you to give our audience, a lot of them are young women who are probably looking at your career and thinking, that's what I want to do, or at least I want to try. I think I'm interested. What advice would you give them? And is there any advice you wish you had at their age that maybe you had to learn the hard way, that you could save them from?
So most important advice is, if you want to get involved in a career in politics, it takes, and I'm sure with any career you could say this sort of stuff, but you have to work really, 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 really hard and be willing to put in the time. And be willing to put in the time starting out in the least glamorous, least thrilling roles on campaigns, right? I didn't graduate from college and then immediately become a senior advisor to Pete Buttigieg, our presidential candidate. When I was in college, I took off for Tom Daschle in South Dakota. I picked up from Dartmouth College, drove across the country to South Dakota, and knocked on thousands of doors, made thousands of phone calls to organize voters in my area. And it can be very depressing. It can be very frustrating. You get doors slammed in your face. You get people hanging up the phone on you. I got mauled by a German Shepherd and had to drive myself 45 minutes to the ER because I'm in the middle of rural South Dakota. I had a guy pull out a gun on me at one of the doors. So it's like, so you have to, I think, if understand that it's not like the Flash, and it's not the getting to go to debates, do debate prep, and be on these these fundraisers with George Clooney. It's more likely that you're going to be at that door getting, having a German Shepherd lock its jaws around your calf. So I think understanding that it is a big time commitment, understanding that you work hard, but that it pays off. And that over time, like if you do put in the work, people will recognize that, and you will eventually get that job that you want. But it does involve a huge amount of sacrifice. I don't know that there's advice that I wish I'd gotten. One thing I would say is, and this is a different dynamic, because social media wasn't really a big thing. Facebook, like I just got a Facebook account in 2003, 2004. So it was like, but I wasn't really posting a ton. Is to know that campaigns will look through everything that you post on social media, and that anything you do or say on social media can and will be used against you. And so
and is
for
that
younger,
as a candidate or as a would-be staffer?
As a would-be staffer.
Okay.
And so certainly with candidates, but more and more over time, on campaigns I've worked on, I have seen, or just generally in politics, posts from staffers from when they were like 18 being sort of pulled, taken out of context, and then they're written up in the media. They're on Fox News, they're in the Washington Post. Like I remember a staffer on Pete's campaign had written something that was complimentary of Louis Farrakhan from when he was in high school. I think he was 16 when he wrote it. The head of the Anti-Defamation League called Pete Buttigieg, who's running for president, to say that he needed to fire the staffer. Pete, to his credit, did not, because he understands that when you're 16, you're going to post this, and that you're allowed to mess up, or maybe not mess up. I don't know, whatever it is in this situation. But there are a lot of candidates and a lot of people in positions like mine who then might be scared off and might say, well, we need to fire this person, we won't hire this person. And so that's just advice that I would give, that for a dynamic that wasn't really there when I was getting started.
That's great, because it kind of goes into the first question that I was going to ask you. I want to acknowledge we have a full class, I think, that is in the audience tonight, Professor Getman's class, and I've been looking at your students' questions. So I just want to pull one to the top, which is, when you are in a position now to be hiring junior campaign staffers, maybe like some of the young men and young women in the audience, what is it that you're looking for? Like, what sets somebody apart where you say, this is a person who I want to be part of this intense experience? What gives somebody the edge? What quality are you looking for in a staffer?
Someone who's, I like someone who is tenacious, really hardworking, but also someone who is open-minded when they walk into a job, right? Because we all have our own political opinions. And one thing that I find sometimes frustrating on campaigns is if people sort of walk in and say this is the, or they get mad because a candidate doesn't share 100% of their views, or a campaign doesn't share 100% of their views, or a campaign, maybe they have different ideas about how to do things. But if you keep insisting on doing things your way, whether you're a 21-year-old staffer or a 61-year-old staffer, you've got to have a collaborative mindset and understand campaigns are very short-term things. It's sort of like a startup that, it goes from 0 to 60 and then it goes completely away.
Out of business any day.
Exactly. And that, that there's no one way to do anything. And understand that you're not always going to get your way, whether it's on policy or on tactics. And so it's very important to me that people do have a collaborative mindset, because it can really jam up a campaign if someone comes in and doesn't have that sort of mindset. And it's really important that in addition to being willing to, speak your mind and be hardworking, that you are willing to be collaborative and work well with others, because it's very, very, very much a team sport.
Got it. One of the questions from someone in the audience is, if you in thinking about the situation with Andrew Cuomo, is there anything or what would you do differently in hindsight? And since we haven't talked about that yet in the interview, maybe you could give a minute or so of background.
Yes. So I write about this in my book. In 2018, I was a consultant on his reelection campaign, both during his primary and his general election. And I stayed in touch with him post 2018. And, ironically, he was the first person to tell me that I needed to write a book. I think probably in retrospect, he would maybe take back that advice, but given some of the stuff I wrote. And this is a part of the book where, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to get into the good, the bad, the ugly, because it's not going to be one. I want to give people a realistic view of what politics is like, but I don't find books where the person writing them is always the smartest person in the room, always making heroic decisions to be particularly credible. Like, that's what Jared Kushner can write one of those books. I didn't want to write one of those books. And anyway, so flash forward to I think March of 2021, and a former staffer of Andrew Cuomo's accused him of sexually harassing her when she worked for him. And so he and his chief of staff called me up and asked, and one, vehemently denied it, and two, asked if I would give him, sort of just with his team, give him advice on how to handle this. And I was like, yeah, I love him, trust him, he's a great guy, always been good to me. But then, and he says, this isn't true. But then, like, a week later, another allegation comes out. And then a week later, another thing comes out. And then, months later in the Attorney General report, there's, another, like, sort of big, troubling allegation. And it taught me a couple things. And there are a couple things that I, in retrospect, sort of wish I had thought through. One is that politics does breed this sense of loyalty in people who work in it, right? Because it's a very tight-knit community. It's very tight-knit between candidates and their staffers, and between, and staffers with each other. And sometimes, though, what I realized in this situation was that I was conflating loyalty with integrity. And that I thought loyalty was the ultimate virtue, and being loyal to people who had been good to you was what mattered most. And it shouldn't be that way. Loyalty should be a two-way street. And if someone, and in this case, it was, Andrew Cuomo, is only looking out for themselves, not telling you the truth, asking you to put your life, your reputation, your time on the line for him, then that person doesn't deserve your loyalty. And that you need to be able to differentiate between, like, earned loyalty, blind loyalty, and understand that it has to be a two-way street. So, that was an important lesson I learned. In terms of, there was something else I was thinking of there. But another thing is at a certain point, I did have a feeling in my gut, like, one allegation, two, you could sort of say, okay, but like at a certain point, like, there was a little bit of a voice in the back of my head saying, this is starting to look like a pattern here. And maybe you should extricate yourself from this situation. But, like, I felt conflicted because I also felt like I was in over my head and had gotten in too deep. But I do wish, looking back, that maybe I'd listened a little bit more to that gut feeling and the voice in the back of my head, and not gotten so caught up in the moment that I was thinking, like, only how do I get him through this, not whether I should be helping him try to get through this. Because you know, and these are the things that keep me up at night. But yeah, those are the main things that I look back and think these are the lessons I learned and the things that I would have done differently.
Must be really hard when you're in the intensity of that moment and you're dealing with the incoming and the onslaught to have perspective to step back and say, should I be doing this, when you're kind of in the operational mode of just doing it.
Yeah, and that's something, and you know, I've talked with a lot of the other folks who are, you know, involved with advising Andrew Cuomo, and say with the exception of two people that my opinions are shared by everyone else on this, and you know, that's part of how I was able to write this book, was consulting with them to talk about how, you know, what we've just been through and our thoughts on all of it, and sort of recreating, you know, what happened there. But it is a common phenomenon on campaigns or in the middle of any sort of crisis, right? It does create this sort of bunker mentality where it's just, you're dealing with so much incoming that you never have the opportunity to take a step back, take a beat, and think rationally about something and think, okay, is this really something I should be doing? Because you're just trying to get through the day to day. And so you don't have, you know, they say hindsight is 2020, but sometimes it's really hard to get that really important perspective in the middle of a crisis. And it's why it's important to have, you know, people around you that can sort of give you that perspective.
So another question is a little bit related to this, in that there's a question about why it seems so uniquely hard for women to be successful running for governor. That right now there's 9 women governors, and many of them, like the situation in New York, became governor, you know, after a man resigned or yielded the office. What special challenges do you see in women running for governor? Is it something about that executive office as opposed to a legislative office? Is it just a different kind of race, a different kind of candidate background that's needed?
Well, so the two things. One is that there's just the reality that not as many women run for governor. Like with any other office, there's, you know, you do see a gap in terms of representation. And sure, there's some exceptions, right? And there are some states where, you know, that sort of break the mold. Like in Michigan, the governor, the attorney general, the secretary of state are all women. They've huge female representation in their state house and state senate, but that's the exception, not the rule. And so one, I think it's just the reality that fewer women run for governor, and you do see more, like proportion wise, I think more women candidates running for Congress or running for Senate. But two, yeah, like, look, politics is a small c conservative business, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And people tend to go with what they've always gone with and what they're comfortable with. And with governors, it's not just women. You also see, you know, there've only been, I think, 3 Black governors in all of American history, and one of them only got there because another governor resigned. So I think that governors' races do skew a little bit, are more toward what we've traditionally done, but we are seeing more women step up and run for governor. But it is probably a lagging. It probably is lagging because of the executive nature of the job. And when people think of a president, when people think of a governor, they think of, you know, traditionally like an older white man, and it takes a while to deprogram people of that. And you know, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan is a total badass. I love her. She's got a ton of swagger. She's someone who is unapologetically who she is. You know, I know that there are a lot of women candidates this cycle. We'll see how they do.
I want to ask a question that's just from my own background. I come from a background of polling, and just wondered what it was like to be on the Buttigieg campaign in Iowa during that sort of fateful last poll before the caucus that was announced and then pulled back. And if you could just kind of say what the drama behind the scenes was like? I'd love to know.
Yeah. I have this, I have a big section on this in my book. Oh my God, that was easily all of Iowa was so dramatic. It was so chaotic. And as a result, I do not think you will see Iowa leading the presidential contest. When you agree
Another
with that?
prediction that you're making, okay?
I mean, I don't know anyone that in politics that thinks that maybe people at the Iowa Democratic Party think that, because they believe in the power of magical thinking. But in terms of that, so with Iowa, in Iowa, there's traditionally what they call the Iowa poll. I know it's not super creative, and it's conducted by the Des Moines Register and this famed Iowa pollster Ann Seltzer, and it is seen as like the gold standard of polls. Like, even as in politics, as people put less and less stock in polls, people really still continue to put stock in Ann Seltzer's polls. And one thing that was fascinating, and just a quick thing, and as a pollster, I don't know if you remember this, but in 2020, in the general election, right before voters voted in November 2020, she released a set of polls across Iowa of the congressional races. Yeah. And I remember Democrats being like, oh my God, no way. Democrats are going to have a much better year than this. Her polls are totally off. They were not. Right. They were not. And what it showed us was what type of year we were going to have, where you could have Joe Biden win fairly handily, and then win these states the Democrats hadn't won forever, states like Georgia, Arizona. And then, in addition to winning back Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, but that down ballot, Democrats were not going to have as good a year, and we saw that certainly in the House races. So she's a good pollster, but I had heard from one of our field organizers that he had gotten a call for the Iowa poll, and that when the pollster was reading off the choices for president, they didn't name Pete. And our field organizer was like, you didn't name my choice, Pete Buttigieg. And the person on the phone was like, hold on, let me get back to you. And was like, oh, sorry, this was an error. So they tell me this, and I have an aneurysm, because it's like a week. This is 4 days before the caucuses. And the problem with polls is, so sometimes they can be good predictors of the future, but they can also change how people vote, because people want to vote for winners. And if you are going to caucus, right, when you caucus versus vote, your support is public. You're not getting, you're not going behind a curtain. Your neighbors are going to know who you caucus for, because you get in this room and you go off into the corner for your candidate. And so there is sort of a different psychological aspect to it. And so we were already asking people to take a big leap of faith to go out and caucus for Pete. Talk about someone who is not your traditional presidential candidate. Sometimes it's not just women, it's, an openly gay candidate, right? And his campaign was historic in that sense, and he faced a lot of stuff there, but a lot of questions about his electability because of the fact that he was an out gay man. And so when I heard this, I was like, and we reached out to Seltzer and all this, and we just didn't get a satisfactory answer on why Pete was left off the survey. And then it turns out maybe there were some font issues, whatever. The Des Moines Register was set to release the poll later that day with CNN. So I called CNN and I'm like, did Ann Seltzer tell you about this? She hadn't, which is a big no-no. She should have divulged that to CNN. So then CNN was pissed off about this, because they don't want their name to be attached to a poll that has flawed methodology. So at the last minute, I go up to a hotel room with Pete's campaign manager, Mike Schmuel, and Chris Marr, who is our national press secretary. And we're watching, CNN, and they have the chyron on the bottom, Iowa poll, coming soon. And then they just change the chyron to Iowa caucus tomorrow. And I'm like, oh my God, I think I killed the Iowa poll. And so they never released the Iowa poll. National reporters were apoplectic, because they were planning to just write all their coverage off this and make all their predictions based off it. Then they didn't have it. Unofficial numbers were leaked, and that showed Bernie in strong first place, followed by Warren, followed by Pete. And then like Biden was, his numbers were really, really low. I can't remember the exact numbers right now. And so the effect that that would have had, and this is not why I killed the poll. I didn't know what the numbers were until afterwards. I know some people tried to spread conspiracy theories that I did this because it would have been bad for Pete. It would have been bad for Pete. The person it would have been worse for would have been Joe Biden. It would have been a real gut punch for people to see the former vice president polling that poorly there. But and it would have been very good for Bernie Sanders. So there's no question in my mind that Sanders would have won Iowa had that poll come out, that Pete would have had a very different night. But it was really, really dramatic.
It's a great behind the scenes moment. Thank you for sharing that. I want to return to one last closing question, but before we do that, let me just give a few announcements about some events that are coming up that we want you to know about. On September 28th, the forum will be featuring Dr. Elizabeth Griffith. She is an AU alum, and she will be discussing her book, Formidable: American Women and the Fight for Equality, 1920 to 2020, which is a chronicle of the fight by white and Black women to achieve equality following the incomplete victory of the 19th Amendment ratification. This is all going to be, I think, in the chat on Zoom for those of you who want to get more information, and can get it also from the Women in Politics Institute website. And then on October 12th, the guest will be NBC correspondent Ali Vitale. She has a book focused on some of the things we've been talking about here tonight, Electable: Why America Hasn't Put a Woman in the White House Yet. And she gets into a kind of a deep dive of some of the things we've talked about tonight, the double standards and special obstacles that women face running for president. And please, for everyone, check the Women in Politics Institute website about upcoming events where you can register and participate and get more information. So with that, let me just close with a final question, Liz, which actually comes from one of the members of the audience, to end on maybe a inspirational note. What's a moment that has really just inspired you? I'm sure you've been through so many campaigns, and maybe you get a little bit jaded, or maybe you don't. But what's something you can look back and say that just really personally touched me or inspired me in the course of your work on political campaigns?
It's not, I don't think this answer is necessarily going to surprise anyone, but it was the moment that Iowa was called for Pete. Like, it ended up being called for him like 6 or 7 different times, but because it really, to me, merged a bunch of really important things. One, there was always this open question. Obviously, he didn't win the nomination. He's in the cabinet. He's not president. So, but there was always from the get-go this open question of, would people vote for the first major candidate who was openly gay? And they would always cite rural voters, or and that sort of answered some of the question. It didn't answer all of it. I mean, I think that it's still a fair question to ask whether voters are fully ready to embrace an openly gay candidate for president. But so that was always an open question, and so that was really inspiring to see, and it gave me some hope for the future of our country, and the future of the electorate, that they were willing to sort of take a chance on him and embrace someone who lived his life in a very different way from your traditional presidential candidate. So that was cool. But it was also, everyone told me that I was insane when I was going to work for Pete, and that, like, why didn't I go try to work for a bigger name, all of that. That's a situation where I did actually listen to the voice in the back of my head. I did go with my gut, and I did decide to sort of give up my life and travel the country with him and be a senior advisor. And so it validated, sort of my faith in myself, my judgment, all of that stuff. And like the importance of, being willing to sort of believe in yourself and have faith in yourself, and do these things. And then it was also just cool because it validated our strategy. And it was a strategy, and the strategy that I talk about in my book. And it was a strategy that was launched with his sort of innovative full frontal earned media strategy. And that a lot of people had criticized him for, had criticized me for, had gone behind my back and criticized, and it paid off. And so it was validating on, like that massive level of being this historic moment of the first state actually going for an openly gay candidate, but then what it meant to me personally and what it meant to me as a strategist, seeing sort of my strategy pay off.
Great. Liz, thank you so much. I want to thank all the members of the audience for joining us here tonight and listening. And Liz, I hope that you will come back when you sign your sitcom and we launch the first episode of your sitcom. We would love to have you come back and be our guest again.
Yes. And I totally encourage, I need to pick up a copy of Electable, but it's Electable, Ali Vitale's book. But right. Ali was someone I saw a lot on the campaign trail. And so she could probably answer some of the questions I was asked better than I can. But I definitely encourage everyone to pick that up and make sure to support your local authors.
Great. Thank you all. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.